Before there was oil, before there was electricity, before there was internet, before there were satellites, before there were nuclear weapons, there was water. Every civilization in human history has been built on water. And every civilization in human history that has collapsed, at least in part, because its water was taken away. The Assyrians knew this. The Mongols knew this. Genghis Khan, when he wanted to destroy a city permanently, didn't just burn it. He destroyed the qanats, the underground water channels. He filled the wells with salt and rubble. He made sure that even if the people survived, they could not return. Because without water, there is no city. There is no civilization. There is nothing. And now, in the EST century, with hypersonic missiles and satellite guidance and drone swarms, Iran has reached back across 4,000 years of military history and rediscovered the oldest strategic weapon ever deployed against a human settlement. They struck the water. And I want to tell you today why this single act, the destruction of Israel's major dam using Ahmad ballistic missiles, may be the most strategically significant moment of this entire conflict. More significant than the power substation. More significant than the strikes on Natanz. More significant, perhaps, than anything else we have seen. Because electricity you can restore in days. Nuclear programs you can rebuild in years. But a nation that cannot drink, a nation that cannot wash, cannot cook, cannot run its hospitals, cannot feed its children, that nation is in existential crisis within 72 hours. Let me show you exactly why. And let me show you what history tells us about where this leads. Part 1. What was hit, and why it matters more than you think. Let us be precise about what happened. Because precision matters in analysis. Vague emotional reactions produce vague, useless conclusions. Iran launched Ahmad ballistic missiles. The Ahmad, introduced in Erding EU, a medium-range ballistic missile with a range of approximately 10 kilometers, capable of carrying a warhead of up to 20 kilograms, with a guidance system significantly more accurate than earlier Iranian missiles. This is not a crude weapon fired blindly at a city. This is a precision infrastructure strike. The targeting of the dam was deliberate, studied, and carefully calculated. And what did it hit? It hit a dam that serves as a primary storage and distribution node for Israel's national water network. The dam's control facilities, its pumping stations, its distribution infrastructure, all struck. All damaged. The main retention wall breached at multiple points. The water management systems that regulate flow into the national pipeline network, destroyed. Now here is what I need you to understand about Israel's water geography, because this is not a country with an abundance of natural water. Israel is a semi-arid state. It receives limited rainfall, concentrated in the north, largely between November and March. It has no great rivers. The Jordan River, which sounds impressive in a biblical sense, is, in hydrological reality, barely a stream by global standards. What Israel has built over 70 years is a miracle of water engineering. The national water carrier. Desalination plants on the Mediterranean coast. Aquifer management systems. Reservoir networks. This is one of the most sophisticated water management systems in the world. Israel famously produces more water than it consumes through desalination and recycling. But that system, like all sophisticated systems, has nodes. Critical junctions where multiple flows converge. Choke points. And a large dam in the distribution network is exactly that kind of node. When you destroy the node, you don't just lose the water stored behind the dam. You disrupt the entire architecture of the system downstream. The pipes that expect water at a certain pressure receive nothing. The pumping stations calibrated for a certain input go dry. The reservoirs that depend on regular refilling begin to drain. And within hours, not days, hours, millions of taps begin to run dry. That is not theory. That is hydraulic engineering. And Iran understood it perfectly. Part 2. The Ahmad missile. Reading the weapon. I want to spend a moment on the Ahmad missile, because the choice of weapon is itself an act of communication. The Ahmad means pillar in Persian. Note the symbolism, is Iran's first domestically developed ballistic missile with a maneuverable re-entry vehicle. What does that mean in plain language? It means that unlike earlier ballistic missiles that follow a fixed trajectory and can be more easily intercepted, the Ahmad can adjust its flight path during descent. It can maneuver around interception attempts. This is not accidental. Iran did not use a crude Shahab, send that might miss by hundreds of meters. They used a precision system specifically because they needed to hit a precise structural target, the control infrastructure of a dam, not simply detonate somewhere in its vicinity. Think about what this tells you. The Iranians did not decide to target this dam last week. This target was selected, analyzed, war-gamed, and assigned to the appropriate weapon system over months, perhaps years of planning. The GPS coordinates of the dam's critical vulnerability points, the control house, the retention wall junctions, the primary pumping facilities, these were in an Iranian military targeting database long before the first missile was ever launched. This is not reactive. This is not emotional. This is the product of a systematic, methodical, patient strategic planning process. And this is what I keep trying to tell people who want to reduce Iran to a regime of fanatical mullahs who make decisions based on religious fury. You are confusing the ideology with the institution. The ideology is the public face. The institution, the IRGC, the aerospace force, the targeting analysts, the engineers, the institution is coldly, soberly, professionally competent. Underestimating that competence has been one of the defining strategic errors of both Israel and the United States for 30 years. And they are still paying for it. Part 3, Water as a Weapon, the historical pattern. Let me take you back. Because predictive history is not about the news cycle. It is about the long arc. The use of water as a weapon, or more precisely, the denial of water as a weapon, is as old as organized warfare itself. In 989 BC, the Assyrian king Sennacherib didn't just conquer Babylon. He destroyed its irrigation network and flooded the city, turning the most magnificent urban center of the ancient world into a swamp. The message was not military. The message was civilizational. You will not rebuild here. In the Mongol campaigns of the 16th century, the systematic destruction of the Persian Khanate system, those underground channels that had sustained cities in arid landscapes for thousands of years, caused demographic collapses that in some regions of Iran and Central Asia took 7 centuries to recover from. 7 centuries. The land is still less populated today than it was in 1200 AD. In World War II, the British RAF launched Operation Chastise in 1943, the Dam Busters raid, specifically targeting the Mon, Edersee, and Sot dams in the Ruhr Valley. The objective was not primarily to flood German cities. It was to disrupt the industrial water supply to the Ruhr steel and armament factories. Water as an industrial weapon. The pattern repeats across history with remarkable consistency. When a belligerent wants to inflict maximum long-term damage on an enemy society, damage that goes beyond the military, damage that strikes at the sustainability of civilian life, they target the water. And now, in Erding Erwu, in a conflict that began with Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear infrastructure, Iran has reached into this ancient playbook and deployed it with RCES-century precision technology. The question, the crucial historical question, is, what does this signal about the nature of the conflict? And here is my answer. It signals that at least one party to this conflict has moved beyond the logic of compellence and entered the logic of punishment. Iran is no longer trying to force Israel to change its behavior through military pressure. Iran is punishing Israeli society itself, making it feel, viscerally and physically, the cost of the conflict. That is a fundamentally different kind of war. And it requires a fundamentally different analysis. Part 4, the humanitarian crisis. What 6 hours without water actually means. I want to be concrete. Because in geopolitical analysis, we often speak in abstractions that insulate us from the human reality we are describing. I don't want to do that. I want you to understand what a national water crisis actually means on the ground. 72 hours. That is approximately how long the human body can survive without water before organ failure begins. But the crisis arrives long before anyone physically dies of thirst. It arrives within hours. Hospitals. A modern hospital requires enormous quantities of water for surgical sterilization, for dialysis machines, for wound cleaning, for patient hygiene, for medication preparation. When water pressure drops below operational thresholds, hospitals begin canceling surgeries. They begin making terrible triage decisions about which patients receive the water that remains. In a country engaged in active military conflict, with battlefield casualties, with blast injuries, with burn victims, the simultaneous collapse of hospital water supply is not a secondary problem. It is catastrophic. Sewage. This is the uncomfortable part that nobody wants to discuss in polite analytical circles. Water systems and sewage systems are coupled. When water pressure drops in a distribution network, sewage can flow backward through the system. This is called backflow contamination. It is one of the primary vectors of cholera, typhoid, and hepatitis A. Cities that lose water pressure are not just thirsty cities. They are cities that within days can face epidemic disease spreading through the very pipes that used to bring clean water. Food. Modern agriculture, even in urban contexts, requires water. Food processing facilities require water. Bread cannot be baked. Restaurants cannot operate. In a society already under military stress, the disruption of the food supply chain is psychologically and practically devastating. And then there is fire. A city under missile attack, with fires breaking out, with damaged infrastructure, with secondary explosions, depends on its water mains for firefighting. A city with empty water mains cannot fight its own fires. Iran, by striking the dam, has not committed one act of infrastructure warfare. It has committed 5 simultaneous acts against health, sanitation, food, fire safety, and psychology. All at once. With 4 missiles. 4 missiles. The cost-to-damage ratio of that strike is one of the most efficient acts of strategic destruction in modern military history. And I say that not with admiration but with cold analytical recognition of what it means. Part 5. The response, and the trap beneath the trap now. What does Israel do? This is where it gets genuinely dangerous. Because Israel faces a dilemma with no good options, which is precisely what Iran intended. Option 1. Massive military retaliation. Strike Iranian infrastructure in kind. Target Iranian dams, Iranian water systems, Iranian power grids. Show that the cost of this attack is unbearable. The problem: Iran's population is already experiencing economic collapse. Its currency has fallen. Its people are in the streets protesting. If you bomb Iranian water infrastructure, you are not primarily hurting the IRGC generals who ordered the dam strike. You are hurting the Iranian middle class, the very people who are already resisting the regime. You are potentially handing the regime a nationalist rallying point. You may save the theocracy by giving it a foreign enemy to point at while its own people suffer. There is a word for this trap. It's called moral hazard. The regime has structured the situation so that the most logical Israeli retaliation produces the outcome the regime most needs for its own survival. Option 2. Absorb the strike. Focus on repair and humanitarian response. Show restraint. The problem: domestically, politically, psychologically, a government that cannot protect its citizens' water supply cannot govern. Netanyahu, or whoever leads Israel at this moment, faces an Israeli public experiencing one of the most visceral forms of civilian suffering imaginable. The political pressure to retaliate is overwhelming. Restraint is not a viable option in Israeli domestic politics. Option 3. Escalate vertically. Not horizontally against Iranian infrastructure, but vertically, bring in more American firepower, potentially strike Iranian command and control, potentially target the regime leadership directly. The problem: that risks a regional war of a scale that the entire international community, including most of Israel's Arab neighbors who have quietly been cooperative, cannot and will not support. Every path leads deeper into the trap. This is what a well-designed strategic operation looks like. Not a single missile strike. A dilemma machine. A situation engineered so that every response available to your enemy makes their situation worse. Iran learned this, I would argue, from 40 years of being on the receiving end of exactly this kind of strategic pressure. When you have been sanctioned, isolated, struck, and cornered for 4 decades, you develop a very sophisticated understanding of how traps work. And you learn to build them. Part 6. The international law dimension, and why IT doesn't matter, and why it does. I know some of you are waiting for me to address international law. The laws of armed conflict. The prohibition on targeting civilian infrastructure under the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols. So let me address it directly. Targeting a dam that provides civilian water supply is, under most interpretations of international humanitarian law, a war crime. Article 16 of Additional Protocol I prohibits attacks on objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. Dams are explicitly mentioned in Article 16 as installations warranting special protection. Iran has, almost certainly, committed a serious violation of international humanitarian law. And here is the uncomfortable second sentence. So, according to the same body of law, has Israel, in its documented strikes on Gaza's water infrastructure, on Lebanese power plants, on Iranian civilian facilities. Now, I am not making a moral equivalence argument. I am making a structural argument. When both parties to a conflict have systematically violated the laws of armed conflict, the law loses its deterrent function. It becomes, instead, a rhetorical weapon, each side citing violations by the other to justify its own actions, while the actual protections the law was designed to provide for civilians simply evaporate. This is what happens in wars of civilizational conflict. The rules were written for wars of limited political objectives. When the objectives become existential, when each side believes its survival is at stake, the rules become noise. And that is the deepest warning embedded in the dam strike. It signals that at least in Iran's strategic calculation, This conflict has crossed the threshold from limited war to existential contest. And existential contests obey a different grammar entirely. Part 7. The Water-Energy-Food Nexus. The real strategic picture. Military analysts tend to think in platforms. Aircraft. Missiles. Tanks. They count kill ratios and sortie rates and ordnance expenditures. But the truly sophisticated strategic thinkers, and I would place the Iranian IRGC planning staff in this category, wherever one thinks of their politics, think in systems. Specifically, they think in what development economists call the water-energy-food nexus. Water, energy, and food are not separate systems. They are one interconnected system. Water requires energy to pump, filter, and distribute. Energy requires water for cooling in thermal power plants and for hydroelectric generation. Food requires both water and energy to produce, process, and distribute. Strike one node in this nexus, and the others weaken. Strike two nodes, and the system begins to collapse systemically. Strike all three, and here is the key insight, and you don't need an army. You don't need to defeat the IDF in the field. You don't need to occupy territory. You achieve strategic paralysis of an entire society without a single ground soldier crossing a border. Israel has already suffered a major power substation strike, disrupting the energy node. Now it has suffered a dam strike, disrupting the water node. If the food distribution infrastructure comes under attack next, Israel faces not just a military crisis but a civilizational sustainability crisis. I want to be very precise here. I am not predicting Israel's collapse. Israel has extraordinary resilience, technological, institutional, social. Its desalination capacity, its emergency reserves, its military's logistics infrastructure, these are genuine assets. But resilience is not invulnerability. And the systematic targeting of the nexus, energy, water, food, is a strategy designed not necessarily to destroy Israel, but to impose unbearable costs on the Israeli population for continuing the conflict. To make the continuation of the war more painful than the political concessions required to end it. That is a strategy with historical precedent. It is, broadly, the strategy the US employed against Japan in 1944 and 1945, submarine warfare against supply lines, strategic bombing of industrial infrastructure, before the nuclear strikes. Impose costs so severe the continuation becomes impossible. Iran is attempting something structurally similar, at a much smaller scale, but with the same underlying logic. There is a verse in the book of Isaiah, and I cite it not for religious reasons but because it captures something true about this moment. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overflow you. The rivers are overflowing. Not in a biblical sense. In a very concrete, hydraulic, geopolitical sense. The water, the literal water that millions of Israeli citizens need to survive, has been weaponized. The infrastructure that represents 70 years of Israeli ingenuity, of making a desert bloom, of building a modern state in an inhospitable environment, that infrastructure is bleeding. And here is the lesson that history is writing in real time, for anyone willing to read it. Security is not just missiles. Security is infrastructure. Security is water. Security is the ability to sustain civilian life under pressure. Israel built perhaps the world's most sophisticated missile defense system. And that system has performed remarkably. But it was designed to defend against a threat conceived in the 20th century framework: incoming warheads, aerial attacks, direct military assault. Iran, patient and methodical, went around the shield. Not over it. Around it. It found the thing the Iron Dome cannot protect, the buried pipes, the concrete dam faces, the pumping stations that no interceptor missile can defend because they are not aerial threats. This is the lesson of every great military innovation in history. The Maginot Line was not breached. It was bypassed. The Atlantic Wall was not destroyed from the front. It was outflanked. No defense is total. No shield covers everything. And an adversary with patience, intelligence, and a your civilization's worth of strategic memory will always find the angle that the defender did not anticipate. The water is running out in Israeli cities right now. Mothers are queuing for bottled water. Hospitals are rationing. Engineers are working frantically in the ruins of a dam that was, until recently, simply part of the background infrastructure of daily life, invisible, taken for granted, assumed to be permanent. Nothing in war is permanent. Nothing in geopolitics is safe by assumption. And the most dangerous words in strategic analysis are always the same four words. We didn't think they did. They thought about it for decades. They planned it meticulously. They chose the right missile, the right target, the right moment. And the lights went out. and the water stopped flowing. Pay attention. Because history is not happening to someone else. History is always, and only, happening to all of us. At once. Class dismissed.